The champagne flute shattered against marble as my sister's scream pierced through the Valentine's Day gala. I watched from across the ballroom, silk gown pristine, as security guards dragged her and my mother toward the exit. The massive engagement ring, the one she'd stolen from my room 3 years ago, glinted under the chandeliers as she clawed at the officers' uniforms. That's my ring. Tell them, Elise. Tell them. I took a slow sip of Dom Perignon, my husband's hand warm against the small of my back. Adrian Chen, tech billionaire, and the man whose grandmother's heirloom now sat on my finger, the real one, not the clever fake I'd let Vanessa steal, leaned down to whisper in my ear. Should I feel guilty for enjoying this? Not even a little bit, I murmured, watching my mother's face contort with rage as she recognized me across the room. The recognition was delicious. I looked nothing like the mousy, desperate girl who'd died choking on poisoned wedding cake 3 years ago. In my first life, this night had ended very differently. The poison had tasted like almonds and betrayal. I remember that clearly, even now. The way the ballroom tilted sideways, how the white lace of my wedding dress suddenly felt like a shroud. I'd looked up at Marcus, handsome, charming Marcus Thornfield, my fiancé of 2 years, and watched him check his watch with cold efficiency while I convulsed on the floor. How much longer? He'd asked someone out of my line of sight. 2 minutes, maybe 3. That was Vanessa's voice, my younger sister, clinical and detached. The dosage was perfect. They'll rule it an allergic reaction. Anaphylaxis from the shellfish. I'd never been allergic to shellfish, but I'd told everyone I was, on Vanessa's advice, months before. She'd insisted it made me seem delicate, refined. Now I understood. She'd been building my own murder cover story, and I'd helped her do it. My mother's face had swum into view, and for one desperate moment, I'd thought she might help me. Call for a doctor, show some maternal instinct. It's better this way, she'd said instead, adjusting her pearl necklace. Vanessa deserves this life. You were always going to be ordinary, Elise. At least your death serves a purpose. The purpose, I'd learned in my final moments of consciousness, was simple. Vanessa would take my place. Wear my dress. Marry my fiancé. Inherit the fortune that Marcus's grandmother had promised to his bride. A clause in her will that specified his wife, not him, would receive controlling shares in Thornfield Industries. They'd planned it perfectly. Even used my sister's uncanny resemblance to me. We were only 11 months apart, our faces nearly identical with the right makeup. The guests were all Marcus's family and business associates. No one from my side would be there to notice the switch. Our father had abandoned us when I was 12, and Mother had spent years isolating me from friends, from any support system. I died alone on that cold marble floor, betrayed by everyone I'd ever loved. And then I'd woken up 3 years earlier, gasping for air in my childhood bedroom, 21 years old again, and very much alive. The first week after my rebirth, I'd spent every night crying into my pillow, terrified it was a dream, terrified it was real. My hands had shaken every time I saw Vanessa's smile or heard my mother's voice. The PTSD was real, even if the death was now theoretical, but slowly, terrifyingly, I'd confirmed it. Every event I remembered came to pass exactly as before. The small things first, a neighbor's pregnancy announcement, a thunderstorm on a specific Tuesday, Vanessa's dramatic breakup with her college boyfriend that she'd sobbed about for 3 days straight, while I made her tea and rubbed her back like the devoted older sister I'd been. The devoted, stupid older sister I'd been. The day I knew for certain was the day Marcus Thornfield walked into my mother's gallery opening. I'd been hiding in the back, pretending to inventory sculptures, when I'd heard that laugh. Cultured, confident, completely artificial. I'd peered around a bronze abstract piece, and there he was, tall and golden-haired and handsome as sin, shaking my mother's hand while his eyes calculated the value of every painting on the walls. My grandmother collects emerging artists, he'd been saying, the exact same words he'd said the first time. I'm always looking for pieces that might interest her. My mother had preened, already counting commission fees. I have a daughter who would be perfect to show you around. She has such an eye for art. Elise! I'd stepped out from behind the sculpture and our eyes had met. In my first life, I'd felt butterflies, excitement, the thrill of being noticed by someone so far above my station. This time, I'd felt only cold certainty. This man would try to kill me. "Lovely to meet you," he'd said, taking my hand and pressing his lips to my knuckles. The same gesture, the same slight curl to his smile. "Charming," I'd replied, pulling my hand back faster than I had before. I'd seen his eyes flicker with interest at the challenge. The hunt had begun again, but this time, I was the one setting the traps. Letting Marcus court me the second time was psychological torture. Every practiced compliment, every calculated gift, every manufactured, spontaneous moment that I now knew he'd planned with the precision of a military campaign. All of it made my skin crawl. But I'd smiled and blushed and played the role of the smitten young woman falling for the sophisticated older man. Because I needed him to feel confident. I needed him to follow the same script. And I needed to understand why. That was the piece I'd been missing in my first life, the question that had haunted me as I drowned in my own poisoned blood. Why had the three of them, Marcus, Vanessa, and Mother, wanted me dead so badly? The answer came in fragments, pieces of conversations I eavesdropped on, documents I shouldn't have seen, connections I finally had the cynicism to make. Marcus needed money desperately. His grandmother's fortune was real, but it was locked in a trust that would only be released to his wife, a clause designed to force him into a stable marriage after years of playboy behavior and bad business decisions. He was drowning in debt from failed tech investments, and he needed that inheritance. But why me specifically? Why not just marry any woman? That answer came from Vanessa, overheard during a phone call she'd thought was private. I'd installed a listening device in her room. Paranoia and rebirth had taught me useful skills, and I'd listened with growing horror as she'd giggled into the phone. "No, Marcus, she doesn't suspect a thing. Mother's been training her for this her whole life. To be grateful, to be easy to manipulate. She thinks she's Cinderella and you're her prince. It's actually kind of sad." A pause. "Because I want what's mine. Mother always loved her more, gave her more attention, and now she gets to marry a billionaire's grandson? No, I'm prettier, I'm smarter, and I don't have her pathetic need to please everyone. When she's gone, I'll be you, and then we can both have everything." The casual cruelty of it had made me vomit. This wasn't just about money. It was about Vanessa's desperate need to be first, to be best, to eliminate the competition she'd invented in her own mind. And Mother, her motivations were simpler and somehow darker. Control. She'd made her entire identity about being the mother of daughters, particularly me, the good one she could puppet. Vanessa was too wild, too rebellious. But if Vanessa became me, Mother could continue living through her daughters' lives while also benefiting from Marcus's gratitude and his money. They were going to murder me for inheritance rights, jealousy, and narcissistic supply. Understanding that had crystallized something in me, some final thread of compassion snapping like overstressed wire. These people weren't family, they were parasites, and I was going to cut them off. The engagement had proceeded exactly as before, right up until Marcus slid his grandmother's ring onto my finger at an intimate dinner 6 months into our relationship. The emerald-cut diamond was magnificent, nearly 5 carats, set in platinum with intricate filigree that dated back to the 1920s. It was worth $250,000 at least. "It's been in my family for generations," Marcus had said, his thumb stroking my hand in a gesture I now recognized as possessive rather than affectionate. "Grandmother insisted I give it to you. She's decided you're perfect for our family." I'd smiled and cried exactly as I had before, except this time, I'd been crying for entirely different reasons. The old woman had never met me. Marcus had shown her a photograph, heavily edited by Vanessa, I'd later learned, and she'd approved based on that alone. She was elderly, increasingly senile, and Marcus controlled her access to information. She had no idea her precious ring was part of a murder plot. 2 days after the engagement, I'd taken the ring to a jeweler I'd researched carefully, one with no connection to my family or Marcus's circles. A tiny shop in Chinatown run by a master craftsman who'd been in the business for 40 years. "I need an exact replica," I'd told Mr. Chen, sliding the ring across his workbench. "Identical in every way except it needs to be made from lab-created stones and standard platinum." I needed to fool even an expert at casual glance, but fall apart under professional appraisal. He'd studied me with dark, knowing eyes. You are in danger. It wasn't a question. I'd nodded slowly. This ring is cursed, he'd said softly, turning it in the light. Not magically, but I see many rings in my life. This one has bad spirit. The person who gives it does not love you. I know. My voice had been steady. That's why I need your help. He'd quoted me a price. Steep, but not impossible with the money I'd been carefully saving from my gallery job, and told me to return in 2 weeks. Then he'd surprised me. My grandson, he'd said, pulling out his phone to show me a picture. Adrian, he is... Similar situation. Bad family trying to control him, take his company. He is smart boy, good boy, but alone. The old man's eyes had been shrewd. Sometimes, people in danger should meet other people in danger. They understand each other better. I looked at the photo of a handsome man in his early 30s, sharp-featured with kind eyes, standing in what looked like a tech startup office. I'm engaged, Mr. Chen, to a man who gives you cursed rings. He'd slipped a business card across the counter. My grandson's company, maybe you visit, maybe you don't, but when you need real help, you call this number. I'd taken the card. Adrian Chen, CEO, Crontech Industries. I'd pocketed it and tried to forget about it. But 3 days later, when I'd overheard Marcus on the phone discussing accelerating the timeline and the wedding is taking too long to arrange, I'd dug out that card and made the call. Adrian Chen had agreed to meet me at a coffee shop, clearly humoring his grandfather's eccentric request. I'd arrived early, chosen a corner table with exits visible, and ordered black coffee I was too nervous to drink. He'd walked in 10 minutes late, moving with the casual confidence of someone who'd built his fortune from nothing and owed no one anything. Seeing him in person versus the photo was jarring. He was more attractive somehow, or maybe it was just the intelligence in his eyes when they landed on me. You're Elise, he'd said, sliding into the chair across from me. Grandfather said you needed help with a family situation. He doesn't usually involve himself in other people's dramas, so I'm curious what made you special. I'm being murdered for an inheritance, I'd said flatly. Or I was, or I will be. Time is complicated. That had made him pause, coffee cup halfway to his lips. Explain. So I had everything. The first life, the poisoning, the betrayal, the rebirth, all of it. I'd watched his face carefully for signs of disbelief, or worse, pity. Instead, he'd listened with the focused intensity of someone analyzing a complex problem. When I'd finished, he'd been quiet for a long moment. Then, prove it. Prove what? That you remember the future. Tell me something that hasn't happened yet. I'd thought quickly, sorting through my memories of news events from 3 years ago. Next week, Tuesday, Crontech's main competitor, Future Wave Industries, will announce a data breach that compromises 10 million users. Their stock will tank 40% in 3 days. The breach happened 2 months ago, but they've been covering it up. Adrian's eyes had sharpened. How do you know that? Because in my first life, I read about it in the news. Your company offered them a security partnership afterward and tripled your market share in 6 months. He'd pulled out his phone, typed rapidly, then looked at me with new respect. If you're right, and I'm not saying I believe you yet, but if you're right, I could short their stock on Monday and make a fortune. Or you could warn their users first and position Crontech as the ethical alternative, I'd said quietly. In my first life, you did the partnership, but you always felt guilty about profiting from other people's data being stolen. You told me once. I'd stopped, realizing I was talking about a conversation that had never happened in this timeline. I told you once? He'd prompted. In another life at a tech conference. We talked for 3 hours about data ethics, And you mentioned that Future Wave deal is your biggest regret. He'd stared at me for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. We've never met before today. Not in this life. The next Tuesday, Future Wave Industries had announced their breach exactly as I'd predicted. Adrian had called me that night, voice tight with controlled shock. Coffee shop, tomorrow, 9 a.m. At that second meeting, he'd asked more questions about his company's future, about decisions he'd made or would make, about his family situation. I'd told him what I knew. His uncle was embezzling from Crontech, small amounts that would add up to millions over 5 years. His mother was being manipulated by a con artist posing as a financial advisor. His cousin was selling corporate secrets to competitors. How do I know you're not setting me up? He'd asked finally. You don't, but check your uncle's offshore accounts, the Cayman Island one specifically. He opened it 3 months ago. Adrian had checked. The account existed, hidden in corporate layers but traceable. The embezzlement was real. 2 weeks later, his uncle had been fired and Mads arrested. Adrian had called me again. Dinner, somewhere nice. Let me thank you properly. I'm engaged, I'd reminded him. To a man who's planning to kill you. His voice had been hard. Elise, let me help. Whatever you're planning, you don't have to do it alone. I'd wanted to say yes so badly it had physically hurt. But I'd learned the hard way that trusting people led to poisoned cake and cold floors. I have a plan. If I need help, I'll call. Promise me. I promise. I'd hung up and spent the next hour crying because Adrian Chen was offering me exactly what I'd needed. An ally, maybe even a friend. And I was too broken to accept it. The fake ring had been ready 2 weeks later. Mr. Chen had done beautiful work. It looked identical to the original, weight and sparkle, nearly perfect. Only a professional appraisal would reveal the lab-created stones and slightly lower-grade platinum. I'd worn the fake, hidden the real one in a safety deposit box under a false name, and continued playing my role. The dutiful fiancé who helped Marcus with his business dinners, who listened to Vanessa's complaints about her life, who accepted Mother's critical comments about my appearance with patient grace. But I'd also been planning. The first step had been documenting everything. I'd recorded conversations, photographed documents I shouldn't have had access to, created a paper trail of Marcus's debts and Vanessa's involvement in his schemes. I'd learned how to be invisible in my own home, how to move silently, how to predict their patterns and exploit the gaps. I'd also started researching poisons. If they were going to kill me with almonds and shellfish, I needed to understand exactly how they do it. The internet was surprisingly helpful once you knew what to search for. So was a retired chemistry professor I'd befriended at a coffee shop, a lonely old woman who loved having someone to talk to about her former career. Cyanide compounds can smell like bitter almonds, Professor Martinez had explained over tea one afternoon. But actual almond extract contains no cyanide. It's just benzaldehyde, which has a similar scent. If you wanted to mask cyanide poisoning as anaphylaxis, you'd need to induce the right symptoms: throat swelling, breathing difficulty. You'd also need access to the victim's EpiPen to ensure they couldn't save themselves. She'd been speaking theoretically for a mystery novel I'd claimed to be writing, but I'd taken careful notes. My EpiPen, the one I carried for my fake shellfish allergy, had gone missing from my purse 2 months before the wedding. I'd found it later, the medication replaced with saline. They'd been preparing for my death even then, taking every precaution. In my first life, I'd never had a chance. The wedding timeline was accelerating exactly as before. Marcus had become more insistent, more present, his mask starting to slip in small ways. Vanessa had started borrowing my clothes, my makeup, practicing being me. Mother had begun phasing me out of gallery operations, giving my responsibilities to Vanessa under the guise of training her. They were so confident, so certain of their plan, I'd let them be certain. I'd played my part perfectly, right up until the night before the wedding. That night, I'd called Adrian Chen. I need that help now. He'd arrived at the coffee shop within 20 minutes, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, hair disheveled like he'd been working late. Probably had been. Crontech was growing exponentially, especially after he'd cleaned house of his corrupt family members. Tell me the plan, he'd said without preamble. I'd laid it out, the fake ring, the safety deposit box, the evidence I'd gathered, the poisoning plot. Tomorrow night, they'll kill me at the wedding reception. Marcus will propose a toast, Vanessa will add the cyanide to my champagne when no one's looking, and I'll die on the floor while they all watch. So we go to the police. Now, tonight. With what evidence? Recordings that might be inadmissible? Plans they haven't executed yet? No. I'd shaken my head. I need them to commit the crime. I need them to think I'm dead. And then I need them to fall apart fighting over the spoils. Adrian had studied me for a long moment. You're not planning to fake your death. You're planning something else. I'm planning not to be at that wedding. I'd met his eyes. I need to disappear tomorrow morning. Completely. I need you to help me create a new identity, access to resources, somewhere safe to stay, and I need you to document everything that happens after I'm gone. They'll search for you. Let them. My smile had been cold. In fact, I'm counting on it. Because when they can't find me, when the inheritance doesn't transfer, when everything starts falling apart, that's when they'll turn on each other. Marcus will blame Vanessa for scaring me off. Vanessa will blame Mother for being too obvious. Mother will blame both of them for being incompetent. And while they're destroying each other, I'll be gathering more evidence. And then I burn their lives to the ground. Adrian had been quiet for a long moment. Then he'd smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that reminded me he hadn't built a tech empire by being soft. I'm in, but on one condition. What? When this is over, when you've destroyed them and taken everything they tried to steal from you, you let me take you to dinner. A real one. No schemes, no plans. Just two people who've survived their family's bullshit and want to eat good food together. I'd felt something crack open in my chest. Something I'd thought had died on that cold floor. Deal. The morning of my wedding, I'd woken up at 4 a.m., packed a single bag with essentials, and walked out of my mother's house for the last time. Adrian had been waiting at the end of the street in a nondescript sedan, engine running. Ready? He'd asked, as I'd slid into the passenger seat. Terrified, I'd admitted. Good. Terror keeps you sharp. He'd pulled away from the curb, heading toward a safe house he'd arranged, an apartment in his name in a neighborhood where no one knew me. I have cameras installed at the venue, audio and video. Everything that happens today will be recorded. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. We're not even close to done. The wedding had proceeded without me. I'd watched the footage later, safe in Adrian's apartment, my hands shaking as I'd seen Mother's face when she'd opened my bedroom door to find it empty. The panic had been immediate and glorious. Phone calls, searching, shouting. Vanessa had been furious, convinced I'd somehow discovered their plan. Marcus had been coldly calculating, already thinking of backup strategies. But the real chaos had started when the lawyer had arrived, the executor of Marcus's grandmother's estate, who'd been required to attend the wedding as part of the trust conditions. If there's no bride, there's no wedding, the lawyer had said flatly. And if there's no wedding, the inheritance clause isn't triggered. The trust continues as written until Mr. Thornfield produces a legal wife. I'd watched Marcus's face go white, then red. Find her, now. They'd searched for 3 days, filed a missing person report, hired a private investigator. Mother had gone on TV weeping about her beloved daughter who'd mysteriously vanished before her wedding day. The performance had been Oscar-worthy, but as days turned to weeks and I remained missing, the cracks had begun to show. Marcus had started drinking heavily, his business ventures collapsing without the promised inheritance to bail him out. Vanessa had grown increasingly erratic, convinced I'd somehow known and escaped deliberately. Mother had started taking pills, her carefully constructed social image crumbling as rumors spread about the runaway bride and what could have driven her away. And I'd watched it all from Adrian's safe house, collecting every moment, every self-incriminating statement they'd made to each other. The best one had come 6 weeks after my disappearance. I'd planted a bug in Mother's house before I'd left. Adrian's tech, military grade, and it had captured a spectacular argument. "This is your fault," Vanessa had shrieked. "You trained her too well to be obedient. She was supposed to just do what we wanted." "My fault?" Mother had shot back. "You were the one who couldn't wait. You had to push Marcus to move up the timeline." "Both of you shut up," Marcus had snarled. "We can still fix this. If Elise is dead, I can have her declared legally dead after 7 years." 7 years! Vanessa had thrown something that shattered. "I'm not waiting 7 years to marry you and get that money." "You're not marrying him at all," Mother had said coldly. "I've been thinking. If we can't find Elise, maybe she had an accident. Maybe she never left town. Maybe she's at the bottom of the river." "What are you suggesting?" Marcus's voice had gone very quiet. "I'm suggesting we need a body. Or enough evidence of death to trigger the inheritance early." The recording had captured 12 minutes of them planning my theoretical murder, complete with specifics about how to stage it, how to create false evidence, how to fool the police. It was more than enough for a conspiracy charge. While my family had been self-destructing, Adrian and I had been building something unexpected. A friendship, maybe more. The safe house had started as a hiding place but become a home. We'd spent evenings talking about everything except revenge plots. His work, my love of art, our shared experience of family betrayal. My uncle cried when I fired him, Adrian had told me one night over Chinese takeout, begged me to understand that he'd only been borrowing the money. Said family should forgive family. What did you say? That forgiveness is earned, not owed, and that if he needed money, he could have asked instead of stealing. But he didn't want help. He wanted to take from me while smiling to my face. I'd thought about my mother, who'd spent years telling me she loved me while planning my death. Family is supposed to be safe. Safe is earned too. Adrian had reached across the table to take my hand, his thumb brushing over my knuckles in a gesture that felt nothing like possession and everything like choice. "You're safe here, Elise. As long as you need to be." 3 months after my disappearance, I'd kissed him for the first time. Slow and tentative and terrified. Because what if I was wrong again? What if he was just another Marcus, just better at hiding it? But he'd kissed me back with a gentleness that made my chest ache, then pulled away to look at me seriously. "I need you to know something. I'm not helping you because I expect anything from you. Not gratitude, not affection, and definitely not this." He gestured between us. "You don't owe me anything, Elise. When you're ready to leave to start your life somewhere else, I'll help you do that too." What if I don't want to leave? The words had tumbled out before I could stop them. Then stay. But stay because you want to, not because you think you have to. I'd pulled him back for another kiss, deeper this time, and felt the broken pieces inside me start to knit together into something new. 6 months after my disappearance, the plan had entered its final phase. I'd worked with Adrian's lawyers to build an airtight case against Marcus, Vanessa, and Mother, fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, embezzlement, identity theft. Everything documented, recorded, verified by multiple sources. I'd also done something else. I'd contacted Marcus's grandmother. The old woman had been in a nursing home, her care carefully controlled by Marcus to keep her isolated. But money could buy access, and Adrian had money. I'd visited her on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, wearing a disguise, dark wig, colored contacts, professional clothes. "Mrs. Thornfield, my name is Victoria Chase. I'm a private investigator working on a case involving your grandson." She'd looked at me with roomy but sharp eyes. "Which grandson? I have 3. "Marcus Thornfield." "Ah, the disappointing one." She'd waved me to a chair. "What's he done now?" I'd laid it out carefully. The engagement, the inheritance scheme, my disappearance. I'd shown her evidence, recordings, documents. As I'd talked, I'd watched her face cycle through shock, anger, and finally a cold fury that reminded me she hadn't built a fortune by being sweet. He tried to defraud my trust, to marry some girl just for money, Probably planned to divorce her the moment the funds transferred. Mrs. Thornfield's hands had been shaking with rage. And you are? I'd removed the wig, the contacts. I'm the girl, Elise Carson, the one who was supposed to marry him and die on our wedding day. The old woman had gone very still. Show me your hand. I'd held it out and she'd studied my bare finger. Where's my ring? Safe. I had a fake made. My sister has been wearing that one, pretending to be me, trying to convince your lawyers she's your future granddaughter-in-law. Mrs. Thornfield had laughed, a dry, crackling sound. Clever girl. What do you want? Your help. I need to prove Marcus was only marrying me for your money. I need him charged with fraud. And I need to make sure my mother and sister go down with him. What do I get? Your ring back and the satisfaction of watching your disappointing grandson lose everything. She'd smiled, showing teeth. Ms. Carson, I believe we can do business. The trap had been set for Valentine's Day, exactly 1 year after my supposed wedding date. Mrs. Thornfield had sent formal invitations to a family gala at a prestigious venue, ostensibly to celebrate a major business milestone. Marcus, drowning in debt and desperate for his grandmother's approval, had attended with Vanessa on his arm, wearing the fake ring, dressed in designer clothes she'd bought with mother's money, playing the role of Marcus's devoted fiancé. Mother had come too, her social climbing instincts overriding any caution. They'd all been so focused on impressing the old woman, on getting back into her good graces, that they hadn't noticed the security cameras, the off-duty police officers working as catering staff, or the prosecutors sitting at the bar. I'd arrived late, deliberately making an entrance in a gown that had cost more than my mother's mortgage payment. Adrian's gift, though I'd tried to refuse it, he'd insisted. You're going to walk in there and show them exactly what they lost, he'd said while helping me with the clasp of my necklace. Let them see you happy, successful, and completely beyond their reach. What if I'm not ready? Then I'll be right beside you, always. He'd meant it. As we'd walked into the ballroom together, his hand at my back, I'd felt not fear but a fierce, burning satisfaction. This was my moment, my victory. Vanessa had seen me first. The champagne flute had slipped from her hand, shattering on the marble, her scream echoing off the high ceilings. That's my ring! Tell them, Elise, tell them! Security had moved in immediately, off-duty officers who'd been briefed on the situation. As they'd restrained Vanessa and Mother, I'd watched Marcus's face cycle through recognition, shock, and finally, calculation. He'd been thinking of escape routes, excuses, ways to spin this. But Mrs. Thornfield had stood from her seat at the head table, aided by her nurse, and addressed the room. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this evening. I'm afraid there's been a situation involving my grandson Marcus and his associates. She gestured to where Vanessa was shrieking, Mother frozen in horror, Marcus backing slowly toward the exit. You see, Marcus attempted to defraud my family trust through a marriage scheme. He was engaged to Miss Elise Carson, she'd indicated me, with the intention of accessing inheritance funds and then murdering her. The gasps from the assembled guests had been gratifying. Miss Carson very wisely fled before the wedding could take place. Since then, Marcus and his co-conspirators, the shrieking woman in the fake ring is Miss Carson's sister Vanessa, and the older woman is their mother Patricia, have been plotting what to do about Miss Carson's disappearance. Thanks to extensive surveillance and evidence gathering, we have comprehensive proof of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. Mrs. Thornfield had smiled, cold and satisfied. The prosecutors are here tonight to place them under arrest. I thought it only fitting that the event be public since Marcus has always loved being the center of attention. As police had moved in with handcuffs, reading Miranda rights, Vanessa had locked eyes with me across the ballroom. This is your fault, she'd screamed. You were supposed to die. You were supposed to let me have this. No, Vanessa, I'd said quietly, though my voice had carried in the sudden silence. I was supposed to live. You just never bothered to see me as a real person long enough to realize I might fight back." Mother had been sobbing, her careful composure shattered. "Elise, please. I'm your mother. You can't do this to me. I love you. You tried to have me murdered." Each word had been precise, final. "You don't get to call it love." Marcus had been the only one who hadn't made a scene. He'd simply looked at me with dead eyes and said, "You won't get away with this." "I already have." I'd smiled. "And by the way, your grandmother changed her will last month. The trust now goes to charity. You were never getting that money no matter what you did." That had broken him. He'd lunged toward me, screaming obscenities, and 3 officers had tackled him to the ground. Adrian had pulled me back, his arms around my waist, and I'd let myself lean into him while chaos erupted around us. "You okay?" he'd murmured. "Better than okay." And I'd meant it. The aftermath had been exactly as satisfying as I'd imagined. All 3 of them had been charged with conspiracy to commit murder, with additional charges for fraud, embezzlement, and in Mother's case, misuse of my identity to take out loans in my name. The trial had been a media sensation. Society wedding murder plot had dominated headlines for months. Vanessa had tried to claim diminished capacity, that I'd psychologically abused her by being the older sister. The jury hadn't bought it, especially after they'd heard the recordings of her gleefully planning my death. Mother had tried to play the victim, a poor widow manipulated by her daughter and a charming con man. But the financial records had shown her as the ringleader, the one who'd first suggested replacing me with Vanessa. The prosecution had painted her as a narcissistic puppet master who'd tried to murder one daughter to benefit the other. Marcus had been convicted on all counts. The judge had been particularly harsh during sentencing, noting that he'd betrayed every principle of family and marriage in pursuit of money he wasn't even entitled to. Vanessa had gotten 25 years, Mother had gotten 30, Marcus had gotten life, with the possibility of parole in 40 years. I'd been in the courtroom for the sentencing, sitting in the gallery between Adrian and Mrs. Thornfield. When the judge had brought down the gavel, I'd felt something inside me finally unclench. A fist of fear and anger I'd been holding for 2 lifetimes. "It's over," I'd whispered. "It's over," Adrian had agreed, taking my hand. Mrs. Thornfield had patted my knee. "Now comes the fun part, dear, rebuilding." Rebuilding had taken time. Therapy, a lot of it, to process both lives of trauma. Days where I couldn't get out of bed, where the memories of poisoned cake and cold floors overwhelmed everything else. Adrian had been patient, giving me space when I needed it, holding me when I couldn't be alone. We'd gotten married 6 months after the trial, a small ceremony at a botanical garden with only Adrian's trusted family and Mrs. Thornfield, who'd insisted on attending despite her poor health. "You remind me of myself when I was young," she'd told me at the reception, her papery hand covering mine. "Smart enough to escape, brave enough to fight back. I'm glad you found Adrian. He needs someone who won't let him work himself to death." "I'll do my best. And take this." She'd pressed something into my palm. Her ring, the real one, the emerald-cut diamond that had started everything. "It's bad luck for some, but I think it will be good luck for you. You've already survived its curse." I'd looked at Adrian, who'd shrugged. "If you want it. If not, we can sell it. And donate the money. Your choice." I'd looked at the ring, this object that had represented so much pain, so much betrayal. Then I'd slipped it on my finger. "No, I'll wear it, but not as Marcus's ring or even your grandmother's ring, as mine. As proof that I survived." The old woman had smiled. "That's my girl." She'd died 3 weeks later, peacefully in her sleep. She'd left most of her fortune to charity as promised, but she'd also left a substantial trust to me, for the brave girl who saved my ring and showed me the truth about my grandson. The money had been unexpected, overwhelming, and Adrian and I had discussed at length how to use it. We'd finally decided to start a foundation for survivors of family abuse, particularly financial and emotional manipulation. No one should have to go through what you did, Adrian had said, as we'd signed the incorporation papers. No one should have to die and be reborn just to realize their family is killing them. The Carson Chen Foundation had launched a year later, offering legal resources, therapy, emergency housing, and job training to people escaping abusive family situations. We'd partnered with law enforcement to train officers on recognizing financial abuse patterns. We'd lobbied for stronger protections for inheritance fraud victims. And we'd told my story, anonymously at first, then publicly when the foundation had grown large enough to need a face. I'd done interviews, written op-eds, spoken at conferences. I died once because I trusted the wrong people, I'd said on a major news program. I came back because the universe gave me a second chance, though I don't know why or how, but I'm using this chance to make sure other people don't need a second life to escape their first one. The foundation had helped over 10,000 people in its first 5 years. Every success story, every survivor who escaped, who rebuilt, who thrived, had felt like another victory over the people who'd tried to erase me. The 5-year anniversary of my death day, the date I died in my first life, I'd decided to visit the cemetery where I would have been buried. The plot existed. Mother had purchased it years earlier, a creepy level of premeditation. It was empty now, just a marked space between two other graves. I'd stood there in the spring sunshine, Adrian beside me, looking at where my body should have been. "Do you think about it?" he'd asked quietly. "The other life?" "Every day." I'd knelt to place flowers on the empty grave. Peonies, my favorite, which no one in my first life had ever bothered to learn. I think about who I was, how naive, how desperate to be loved that I ignored every warning sign. You weren't naive. You were trusting. There's a difference. Maybe. I'd stood, dusting off my knees. But I'm not that person anymore. She died, really died, even if her body didn't. The person I am now was born from her ashes. Like a phoenix. Like a phoenix who learned to fight back. I'd smiled at him, this man who'd helped me rebuild myself from nothing. Thank you for believing me when no one else would have. For helping me when you had no reason to. I had a reason. He'd pulled me close, his forehead resting against mine. From the moment you walked into that coffee shop and told me you'd been murdered in a past life, I knew you were either completely insane or the most interesting person I'd ever meet. I'm glad it was the latter. What if it had been both? Then I'd have loved you anyway. The words had stolen my breath, even though we'd said them before. I love you too, in both lives probably. Though we never got the chance in the first one. Then I'm glad we have this one. We'd left the cemetery hand in hand, the empty grave behind us, and I'd felt lighter than I had in 2 lifetimes. Now, 3 years after that Valentine's Day gala, I stood in the ballroom of a 5-star hotel for the Carson Chen Foundation's annual fundraiser. The theme was Second Chances, and we'd raised over $10 million to expand our programs. Adrian had been the keynote speaker, talking about his own experience with family betrayal and how he'd found healing through helping others. I'd watched him from the side of the stage, my husband, my partner, the person who'd chosen me when I'd been at my lowest. After his speech, we'd danced, a proper waltz this time, not the stilted performance I'd done with Marcus in my first life. This was real. This was chosen. This was love that didn't come with conditions or poison. I have news, I'd told him as we'd swayed to the music. Good news or bad news? Good, very good. I'd placed his hand over my stomach where a barely there swell was just beginning to show. We're having a baby. Adrian had gone very still, his eyes searching my face. Are you sure? Are you ready? I know with your history. I'm sure. And I had been. I'm ready to create a new history, one where family means something different than what I learned, one where our child grows up knowing they're loved, protected, chosen every single day. He'd kissed me then, deep and sweet, while around us the fundraiser had continued. Survivors sharing stories, donors writing checks, the foundation we'd built together, changing lives one person at a time. Later that night, after the gala had ended and we'd returned to our home, the penthouse Adrian had bought when Krontech had gone public, I'd stood at the window looking out over the city lights. "Do you think they know?" I'd asked. "In prison, do you think they understand what they lost?" Adrian had come up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "Does it matter?" I'd thought about it. Mother in her cell, aging without her daughters to control, Vanessa in prison therapy, finally being told her narcissism wasn't someone else's fault. Marcus, who'd traded his freedom for money he'd never actually been entitled to. "No," I'd said. Finally. "It doesn't matter. They're not part of my life anymore, not even as villains in my story." "Then what are they?" "A cautionary tale. A reminder. A lesson I learned so other people don't have to." I'd turned in his arms, pressing my palm against his chest, where his heart beat steady and strong. "You know what's funny? In my first life, I thought love meant sacrifice. Giving up pieces of yourself to make other people happy. Being small so others could feel big. And now? Now I know love means choice. You choose me every day, even when I'm difficult or broken or scared. And I choose you back. That's what makes it real." Speaking of real, Adrian had pulled a small box from his pocket. "I know we're already married, but I wanted to give you something that was just yours and mine. Not from my grandmother, not part of any scheme. Just us." He'd opened the box to reveal a simple platinum band set with a single perfect sapphire. My birthstone. A detail only someone who truly knew me would remember. "It's beautiful," I'd whispered. "It's a promise. That I'll keep choosing you. Every day, in this life and whatever comes after." I'd let him slide it on my finger, next to the emerald-cut diamond I'd reclaimed and the wedding band we'd chosen together. 3 rings, 3 chapters of my life. Trauma, survival, triumph. "I choose you too," I'd said. "In every life. In every version of this story." And standing there in our home, surrounded by evidence of everything we'd built together, I'd finally let go of the last shadow of my first life. The fear, the anger, the need for revenge, all of it dissolved into something softer, something sustainable. Peace. The baby had been born on a Tuesday in autumn, a perfect little girl with Adrian's eyes and my stubborn chin. We'd named her Victoria, after the fake name I'd used when meeting Mrs. Thornfield, a reminder that sometimes you have to become someone else before you can truly become yourself. Holding her for the first time, I'd felt the weight of 2 lifetimes settle into something manageable. All the pain, all the betrayal, all the impossible second chances, they'd led here, to this moment, to this new life that was entirely untouched by the poison of my past. "Hi, sweetheart," I'd whispered to her. "You're so loved, so wanted. And I promise you'll never have to wonder if your family chose you, because we will choose you every single day of your life." Adrian had pressed a kiss to my temple, his hand gentle on our daughter's head. "She's perfect." "She is." And I'd meant it. Mrs. Thornfield's ring had caught the light as I'd adjusted Victoria's blanket. The diamond that had once represented death and betrayal now reflected only life and hope. 5 years after my supposed wedding day, I'd finally married someone who actually chose me. Not for money, not for status, not for what I could give them, but for who I was, scars and all. And sitting in that hospital room, my husband beside me, our daughter asleep in my arms, I'd finally understood what I'd been reborn to learn. The opposite of betrayal isn't revenge, it's choice. Choosing to survive, choosing to fight back, choosing to build something new from the ashes of what was destroyed, choosing love that sees you, not what you can provide, choosing to let go of the people who tried to kill you, not because they deserve forgiveness, but because you deserve peace. And choosing finally to live, really live, in a way I'd never been allowed to in my first life. The girl who'd died choking on poisoned cake was gone. In her place stood a woman who'd learned that the best revenge wasn't destruction. It was becoming so thoroughly, completely happy that your enemy's opinions ceased to matter at all. I'd let my sister wear my engagement ring, the fake one that represented false love and false promises. And then I'd married someone who gave me a real ring, one that represented real choice and real love. That was the story I'd tell Victoria someday, when she was old enough to understand. Not the details of the murder plot or the betrayal. She didn't need that darkness. But the lesson underneath: some people will try to use you. Some people will try to hurt you. Some people who claim to love you will be lying. But if you're brave enough, if you're strong enough, if you refuse to let them define you, you can choose something better. You can choose yourself. And that choice, that fundamental decision to value your own life and happiness above others' expectations, will save you in ways revenge never could. The end. 10 years after my death day, the Carson Chen Foundation held its anniversary celebration. Over 100,000 survivors had been helped by our programs. Legislation had been passed in 15 states, making inheritance fraud easier to prosecute. Our emergency housing network had expanded to 30 cities. I'd been invited to speak at the event to share my story one more time. Standing at the podium, looking out at a room full of survivors, advocates, and donors, I'd felt the weight of both my lives, the one I'd lost and the one I'd built. I died once, I'd begun, my voice steady. Or I would have if the universe hadn't given me an impossible gift. I came back with knowledge, with warning, with a chance to escape the people who wanted me gone. I'd paused, seeing Adrian in the front row with Victoria on his lap, her younger brother James squirming beside them. Our family, our choice. But here's what I learned. It doesn't take death and rebirth to recognize abuse. It doesn't take magic or supernatural second chances to deserve safety. Every single person in this room, every survivor we've helped, every person still trying to escape, you all have the same right I had to choose yourself. I'd gripped the podium, feeling the rings on my finger. The reclaimed diamond, the simple sapphire, the wedding band, symbols of death, survival, and love. You don't need a second life to deserve a second chance. You just need the courage to take it. And when you do, we'll be here to help, because that's what this foundation is. Proof that surviving isn't enough. You deserve to thrive. The applause had been thunderous, but I'd barely heard it. I'd been looking at my family, at the life I'd chosen, at everything I'd built from the ashes of betrayal. Later, after the event, Adrian and I had stood on the balcony of the venue, watching the city lights. Any regrets? He'd asked. I'd thought about it seriously, the therapy sessions where I'd sobbed about my first death, the nightmares that still occasionally woke me, the complicated grief of mourning a mother who'd tried to kill me. No, I'd said finally. Even the pain taught me something. It taught me what real love isn't. And that made it possible to recognize what real love is when I found it. Which is this. I gestured between us. You, our kids. The foundation. A life built on choice instead of obligation. Freedom instead of fear. He'd kissed me then, sweet and familiar, and I'd tasted not revenge or vindication, but simple, profound happiness. The girl who'd died on a cold floor would have called this a fairy tale ending. The woman I'd become knew better. This wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning, one I'd fought for, bled for, survived for, one I'd chosen, and that made all the difference.